Antiquity Matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Dr. Susanne Seperson, and this is our 12th episode of the podcast, Antisemitism in the United States and in Society on hmTv. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest to you, Mr. J.D. Solomon, a writer of historical fiction. We're going to turn now to part two. Part one, we had discussed some of the major cases in terms of perpetrators and victims and consequences of anti-Semitism. And we started with Lerner and Loeb. I shouldn't say that. We started off with, Lerner and Loeb. And then we went on to Daisy Douglas Barr, who was a female leader in the, I'll call it the anti-Semitism movement. The first person we discussed was Leo Frank. But we're moving on now to Father Charles Coughlin and the role he played in American politics. Again, a rabid anti-Semite. I did not know he was a Canadian-American Catholic priest based near Detroit, and one of the first mass media influences. He was called the radio priest. And during the 1930s, when the United States population was about 120 million, an estimated 30 million listeners tuned into his weekly broadcasts. So I would like to ask you, Mr. Solomon, what do you think was the attraction of these people to such a demagogue?
Well, the radio priest, Charles Coughlin, was really the forerunner of hate radio and now hate podcasting. I mean, it's the same phenomenon. If you say, what was the attraction to him? What's the attraction to some of these people who have been, on the radio and now on podcasts, who are spewing very similar anti-Semitic vitriol? He was incredibly influential, reaching 1 out of 5 American households every week, and blaming the Jews for pretty much everything wrong with the world. He was an open admirer of Adolf Hitler. He hated FDR, and he was actively anti-interventionist. We're talking about the 30s. But he was the forerunner and the forefather of what we know today to be hate radio and hate podcasting. And, there's always, I think, an audience everywhere, but we're looking at America, for somebody who raises a finger and points a finger at some entity that can be blamed for whether it be hardship or injustice or whatever. And, he was an anti-Semite. It was interesting. So the church ultimately forced him to abandon his radio show, but it didn't stop him. He ran this publication, this newspaper, which itself was ultimately shut down. He actually started a political group as well. The FBI shuttered that. And he ended up, living in obscurity and dying in obscurity. But at his peak, he was very influential and scarily so.
He did a lot of damage. So I'll just say one of the things that I realized is that he flip-flopped a lot. He sort of went, anti-communist, pro-socialist, and then anti-interventionist and very fascist. It was sort of like depending on what the wind blew and what he needed at that moment. So he flip-flopped, and it didn't seem, even as a political philosophy, he wasn't held accountable. It seemed to me that he was held accountable really after the United States entered the war, 41. And that's when he sort of got his comeuppance. But I saw that November 20th, 1938, which is just around the time of Kristallnacht, he gave a talk, a broadcast, excusing the Nazis for what they had done. And he said that the reason he lost his ownership or his right to broadcast on some radio stations is because they were, quote, under Jewish ownership. And finally, in one of his columns that he wrote, he basically copied the speech of Joseph Goebbels, and was the German propaganda minister, and he just plagiarized the whole thing, saying that it was good to kill Jews. So ultimately, Coughlin lost out because he was tagged as an enemy sympathizer. And that sort of did him in. But at the same time, if I recall correctly, his influence is huge. He also had, he had influence on Henry Ford, who was another American leader, and yet we know, what he did in terms of the Ford Motor Company and so on and so forth. But the other side of him was the fact that he promulgated the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a Russian Tsarist fabrication, and he published it in the Dearborn Independent newspaper. So if you would like to comment on that, that would be welcome.
Yeah, so in the 20s, Henry Ford, well, he was known to be a terrible anti-Semite, spewing just everyday business affairs, vitriol about and against Jews. But he published this newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and which was just filled with one headline after another with a problem of world Jewry would be the typical headline. Parroting the elders' hoax, and he distributed that to all of his assembly line workers. He mailed it to consumers across the country. People who would buy their Model T, and they'd get the owner's manual and the newspaper in the glove box. Ultimately, he had a lot of backlash. So in 1927, he shuttered the newspaper. And he issued somewhat of an apology for it. The Jewish community had been actively boycotting Ford because of that. And I think it did begin to hurt their bottom line. So he was really a precursor to Father Coughlin because he kind of pushed that aside. But there's a story, perhaps apocryphal, I don't know, but that he sent annual birthday gifts to Adolf Hitler up until the time that it was no longer possible. That's at least the stories about that go. But yeah, it's all part of what really was a witch's brew of anti-Semitism in the 20s and 30s that kind of, as I said before in an earlier episode, made it okay to be anti-Semitic.
So we turn now to another very famous American hero who was also anti-Semitic, and that's the aviator Charles Lindbergh. And Lindbergh had profound influence, across the United States. He was the first solo nonstop transatlantic flight in 1927, flying from New York to Paris on the Spirit of the St. Louis. And at the same time, his life was filled with tragedy because his son was kidnapped. And so that was, highly publicized. Yet he was also connected to Henry Ford through their connection with the America First Committee, which was founded in 1940 and ostensibly aimed to keep the United States out of the war. But, Lindbergh's speeches all over, they parroted Ford's speeches about our need to prioritize America's interest over international interests, wanting to be an isolationist. But what do you think prompted Lindbergh to be an anti-Semite?
So Lindbergh was a complicated man. And one of the talks I give is about the Lindbergh kidnapping. So he was a prominent and adherent of eugenics, the belief that in the 20s and even the 30s was popular and not yet discredited that the human race really should be and was destined to be controlled and merged into an entity of humanity, of people who were daring and brave and strong, people like him. That certainly was a bond he had with the Nazis. So after the trial of Hauptmann, who was convicted of kidnapping and murdering Lindbergh's son, the governor of New Jersey felt that, as with Frank, was a travesty of justice and was going to reopen the case. And Lindbergh promptly moved his family to England, where he was throughout the 30s. And he made several visits to Nazi Germany during that period, toured their military-industrial complex, their Luftwaffe fields, and the factories at Goering's invitation. And at one point, I think in 1938 or 39, he received Nazi Germany's highest civilian honor, as Henry Ford had before him. And he accepted it and was roundly criticized by the American press for that. He was urged to revoke it, but he didn't. And then he felt that there was no way the United States could win a war with Germany, that their air power was too far superior. And he came back to America to say that. And then in a famous speech in September 11th, 1941, in Des Moines, Iowa, Lindbergh kind of said the quiet part out loud. He really, for the first time there, overtly talked about the Jews in America being a precipitating factor in driving America into a war that he felt America couldn't win. He was roundly criticized for that speech as well, but didn't back down. Then just 60 days later, of course, America was attacked in Pearl Harbor, and he changed. He actively wanted to get back his military commission, which he had resigned in protest some years earlier. Found a way to Roosevelt wouldn't give it to him. Lindbergh found a way to serve nevertheless. He went to the Pacific. He trained fighter pilots. He even snuck aboard some 50 combat missions. So a complicated, complex man, but again, giving voice to this kind of anti-Semitic trope of the Jews being a controlling influence in the world, in world affairs, and being more interested in their own agenda than in their overall countries or communities. These are historic anti-Semitic tropes. And, again, as I say, part of this witch's brew of anti-Semitism that made it okay for everyday Americans to be anti-Semitic.
I would like to make sure that we have enough time to get to two more items, or we'll see. One group that I had never heard of, and I should just say as an aside, my parents are both Holocaust survivors, and I have taught a class on the Holocaust, so I really felt that I knew a lot, and I certainly knew about the Camp Siegfried and the German camp and the restrictions on Long Island, but I had never heard of the Silver Shirts. So could you just take a few minutes to talk about the Silver Shirts?
Yeah, that was a smaller group, kind of aligned with the Klan as a pro-fascist, avowedly Jew-hating organization. They claimed to have 1 million members. So it probably was not anywhere near that. They published a widely distributed newspaper, headlines like "Free Speech Stopped by Jew Riot" or "German Jews Get What They Asked For." It was more fringe than the Ku Klux Klan, but again, it was emblematic of this period when it was this in-your-face anti-Semitism was just part of the public sphere of life, and this through the 30s, this concept that German Jews are getting what they asked for, that was taken right from the Nazis' playbook for their American strategy. They needed Americans to believe that if German Jews were being persecuted, it was their own fault. They had it coming. And whether it was the Silver Shirts, Father Coughlin, Henry Ford, or others, all were reinforcing that. And this is also part of a historic anti-Semitic trope, which we even see bubbling up today, that, yeah, maybe this, they had it coming.
I hear you. And their home base was in North Carolina. And I know this is biased on my part, but somehow I have a real problem with thinking, well, maybe if you never met a Jew, you didn't know any Jews. But when there are Jews all around you and you must have some interaction with Jews and that you still are so anti-Semitic, I find that harder to understand. And that's why I want to go to Yaphank, Long Island, which was at that point, when it was in vogue. It was at the ends of the earth. It was countryside, undeveloped. But Camp Siegfried in Yaphank was a camp that people sent their children to, and they marched around wearing their brown shirts, pledging allegiance to Hitler. And each of the street names were named after, different leaders of the Nazi movements, Goebbels Street and Strasse and Hitler Strasse and, so on and so forth. And most people didn't even know about that. What struck me about all of that was that they were only allowed to sell property, even once they disbanded. There was a property covenant. They were only allowed to sell their homes to other people of German background, ancestry. And one young couple said, but I want to sell my house. I can't wait to find a German, person who wants to buy my house. And so they finally took it to the New York State Supreme Courts. And it was Attorney General Schneiderman who finally got the rules, disallowed as being discriminatory. But this happened in 2017. And I remember reading it in the local paper, and I said, you've got to be kidding. So how can we explain the fact that this was hidden in plain sight for so many years, even after World War II ended?
So Camp Siegfried was part of a network of children's Nazi-themed sleepaway camps run by the German American Bund. That was an organization that arose around 1935. And with a clear agenda of aligning itself with Nazi Germany, Hitler. And they were very active. At first, they were sort of written off by most Americans as kind of buffoons, and they often look the part. But after some investigative journalism, Chicago newspaper writer, embedded himself with the Bund at one point, and there were some congressional hearings, and they really did emerge as a major threat. As you pointed out, they ran these sleepaway camps, the largest of which was Camp Siegfried, and it wasn't just, these camps weren't just for the kids. Every weekend, there'd be big rallies there. The parents would come, and in fact, it was so popular that the Long Island Railroad ran a dedicated express train from called the Siegfried Express from Penn Station to Yaphank, where at the station stop they were greeted by all the children dressed like Hitler Youth, with giving the Nazi salute to their parents coming off, and they'd hold these big rallies. The community you discussed, German Gardens, evolved around the camp as a summer enclave for the parents, and that the camp was shuttered in 1940, certainly after Pearl Harbor. 1941 was its last season, and even by then it had been diminished. And then it was shuttered, and there'd be no more German-themed sleepaway camps. But as you said, the community German Gardens lived on after the war. It was for many years, decades, an enclave of bungalows year-round. They did change the street names, but there are pictures that I've seen of these street names, Adolf Hitler Strasse and Goering Strasse, what have you. But The Bund was the organization then that in 1939 held that famous Madison Square Garden rally, where it was a full-fledged Nazi hate rally in the middle of the city with the largest Jewish population in the world. But as long as we're talking about criminal cases, what's interesting is the leader, the Bundesführer, he called himself Fritz Kuhn, couldn't be stopped from holding that rally. I mean, there was nothing illegal about holding a pro-Nazi, anti-Jewish rally in America. So LaGuardia, who was half Jewish, sicked his DA, Dewey, said, find something, anything that we can use to shut this guy down. And perhaps not surprisingly, Dewey found that the guy was embezzling, Kuhn was embezzling money to use on spending on his various girlfriends all over the country. And he was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 2 years in Sing Sing prison. And that was shortly after that, the 1939 rally. And that led to the decline of the Bund, which of course came to a screeching stop, as did the anti-interventionist movement and everything else with Pearl Harbor.
So I hope we have enough time to get to this. I always used to think of the KKK as a historical group, but unfortunately, I don't think it's just historical. I think it's still around. I'll just share two personal experiences, and if you would comment. Must have been the 1980s. My family and I drove down from New York down to Florida, down the East Coast, and we stopped in Virginia. We were doing the Civil War tour, and we went into a little shop that had little figurines of little soldiers. I had two young boys and my daughter with us at the time, but they were, little figures of blue and gray soldiers, and my children loved that stuff. And my older son, who must have been about 5 maybe at the time, he ran into the store and, looking for these toys, which that's what they were to him. And he ran all the way to the back through the curtains. And of course I had to run after him. And there I saw maybe a dozen men in white KK outfits and a Jewish prisoner World War II concentration camp outfit hung on the pegs all around the wall with their masks there. And I grabbed my son and we ran out, and I was shaking because, this was stuff you read about. It wasn't something that you ran into. Having said that, just this past week, I attended a conference at Cardozo School of Law, which is part of Yeshiva University. And there were 3 people speaking: a woman who was a daughter of Holocaust survivors from Germany, a black man who was obviously, I'll say preaching, but advocating for, as was the woman, for good relationships. And then there was a man who was there, and he called himself a white redneck, good old Southern boy. And he talked about being part of the groups, that were really anti-Jewish, anti-black, of course, and how the 3 hooked up and what his personal story was. And they all talked about their different experiences as to how they got to where they got. And as I said, I thought this was history. It's not history. It's present day. They're working to break up these white anti-racist, anti-Semitic and racist groups and so on. But here we are today, just a couple of, maybe a week or 2 before the election in New York City. And now we have, and before just this past spring, we had what I'll call riots at elite universities, including at Columbia University in New York City, where they verged on anti-Semitism, or were anti-Semitic. And the candidate Mandami is tempering his speech right now, hoping to be elected, and it looks like he will. But clearly, some of his past associations and comments were anti-Semitic. So how do you explain to what I'll call full circle?
It's interesting. I am less concerned about the instances of anti-Semitism on elite college campuses and whatever happens in the New York City mayoral race. I mean, the media likes to grab onto those things, but the bigger threat that I see is related to some of the things we've already talked about, the rise of Christian nationalism and the hate speech that's coming from these far right podcasters, echoing Father Coughlin. And the fact that particularly those instances are not seeing the same kind of attention as the students who are protesting, or the New York City mayoral race, which I'm not really sure on a bigger picture of the world stage has that much influence. But the fact that this pro-Hitler, anti-Jewish venom is being spewed by influencers with millions, 7 million, 10 million followers, is not being roundly criticized by the White House, not being really hammered by some of the Jewish organizations that are chartered to do this, not being looked at by the administration. To me, that is much more worrisome, because I think it's pervasive, and it can lead to the stimulation of real violence, the kind of violence that we saw in England, in Manchester, in Pittsburgh, in Washington, D.C., when there's not a uniform, immediate, strong hammer that comes down on this hate speech. That's the danger that I see.
I hear you. I want to thank you. I think hate speech and hate action should be condemned across the board, right, left, political, in the media, in entertainment, in sports. There's no room for this. And I appreciate your efforts, and certainly the Nassau County Holocaust Museum and Tolerance Center's effort to move us in a much better and the correct direction. So I want to thank you for joining us. And we can all look forward to your continued commentary, maybe a new fictionalized novel on, dealing with some of these issues. And I thank you for joining us. Be sure to subscribe, share, and stay connected for more engaging conversations. Until next time, make it our time. Take care and be well. Thank you.